Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, the Prime Minister has accused opposition MPs and rebel Conservatives of undermining Brexit negotiations with Brussels. Boris Johnson said the UK was less likely to get the deal it wanted if the EU thought MPs were trying to block a no-deal exit. Mr Johnson's facing fierce criticism for his decision to suspend Parliament next month. Among those opposing the move is the former Conservative Prime Minister Sir John Major, who's joined a legal case at the High Court to halt the suspension. Our chief political correspondent Vicky Young reports now from Westminster.
Save our democracy! Stop the coup!
When it comes to Brexit, feelings run high. This week's announcement that Parliament wouldn't sit for 5 weeks brought angry protesters to the gates of Downing Street. The government insists MPs still have plenty of time to express their views. Critics say Boris Johnson is behaving like a tin pot dictator.
When you became Prime Minister, you talked about uniting the country. But now you're talking about forcing through a no-deal Brexit, something that you know democratically elected Parliament does not agree with. You're being deliberately divisive, aren't you?
We want to do a deal. I've talked over the last few days to lots of leaders around the EU, and everybody can see the rough shape of what needs to be done. It's going to take work. It's going to take a lot of energy for us to get there. And the best way to do that is if our friends and partners over the Channel don't think that Brexit can be somehow blocked by Parliament.
But they're trying to block no deal. They're not trying to block Brexit, they're trying to block a no-deal Brexit.
The weird thing is that the more the parliamentarians try to block the no-deal Brexit, the more likely it is that we'll end up in that situation. So the best thing now is for us to get on and make our points to our European friends with clarity and with vigour, and that's what we're doing.
But now this former Conservative Prime Minister says he'll challenge Mr Johnson in court. Sir John Major knows all about Tory fights over Europe. They plagued his time in office. Today he offered to help campaigners make their case that the government is breaking the law. That's one battle, the other will be fought in Parliament. They'll have less time, but opposition parties and some Tories will try to change the law to force the government to delay Brexit again.
I hope that Parliament will take a series of actions in a proper, orderly way that by the end of the week mean that Boris Johnson knows that as Prime Minister he has the backing of many of us to get a deal, but that if he doesn't get a deal he's going to have to seek an extension.
To succeed, MPs from several parties will need to work together. So are they confident?
I'm always hopeful and I don't want to make predictions. All I know is that what we're trying to do is the right thing to do, and I believe a majority of MPs recognise that a no-deal exit is very damaging to our economy.
Meanwhile, ministers have promised to step up the tempo on talks with the EU, but Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister isn't sounding optimistic.
At the moment, nothing credible has come from the British government in the context of an alternative to the backstop. And, you know, if that changes, great. We'll look at it in Dublin, but more importantly, it can be the basis of a discussion in Brussels. But it's got to be credible.
Boris Johnson's being asked searching questions from many sides.
Did you always have the ambition of being Prime Minister?
Well, no, I had various ambitions. I briefly thought that I could be a rock star, but then I had a plan to be I wanted to make kitchen tiles, and that was a total flop.
He'll hope his Brexit strategy doesn't end up the same way. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
One of the Chancellor Sajid Javid's advisers has been sacked by Downing Street amid efforts to impose greater staff discipline in Whitehall. Sonia Khan was questioned about government leaks by Boris Johnson's senior adviser Dominic Cummings. There's no evidence that Ms Khan had put sensitive information in the public domain. Mr Javid has refused to comment on her sacking amid reports that he hadn't been told in advance that she was to be dismissed. A judge at Scotland's highest civil court has refused to order an immediate halt to Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament. The court will instead hear full arguments next week. Well, our Scotland editor Sarah Smith is outside the court for us now. And Sarah, who's won here?
Well, the Appellants who were brought this case today didn't get the judge to do what they wanted, which is to issue this immediate ban to stop Boris Johnson's plans today. But the judge did agree to fast-track this case so that next week the Court of Session will give a full ruling on whether or not the Prime Minister is acting legally. The judge said it was in the public interest to have this case, which has been brought by a cross-party group of MPs and peers, heard as soon as possible. So he'll hear arguments on Tuesday. We expect a ruling on Wednesday. And of course, a key thing to remember with this timetable is that the first date on which Parliament could be suspended is next Friday, so we'll get the ruling before then. There was one rather surprising thing that happened in court today. The lawyer who was representing the anti-Brexit politicians said that he thought that Boris Johnson should give to the court a sworn statement under oath outlining his reasons for wanting to prorogue Parliament. Well, the UK government said they were happy with the outcome of this case today.
OK, many thanks, Sarah Smith there. So next week will look something like this. MPs return to Westminster on Tuesday. They'd normally be sitting for a fortnight before breaking for the party conferences. On the same day, the Court of Sessions in Scotland is due to hold that full hearing that Sarah was referring to on the legality of suspending Parliament. The following day is then due to be taken up with the Chancellor Sajid Javid's statement on government spending and also Boris Johnson's first Prime Minister's questions. Then the next day, a court is due to hear the legal challenge from Gina Miller and Sir John Major on suspending Parliament. There's also a further hearing in Northern Ireland the following day. And if all those legal challenges fail, Parliament is due to be suspended sometime between the 9th and 12th of September. Well, we can speak now to Vicky Young, who's in Westminster for us. And Vicky, a packed week ahead with who knows what will happen.
That's right, Boris Johnson really facing battles on all fronts. First of all, that court case, the extraordinary prospect of a former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major, suggesting he's willing to give evidence in court to prove that the current Conservative Prime Minister is acting unlawfully. Then you have that parliamentary battle, and for all the protests and the anger about the suspension of Parliament, actually most MPs think they do have time to maybe change the law, get a bill through that would force Boris Johnson to delay Brexit again. Now, Downing Street thinks that would be an awful prospect. They think it's a complete waste of time. They think it's the last thing that people want, a delay for no particular reason, for no purpose, just adding to uncertainty. So really, by the end of next week, and I think MPs probably do have the numbers to achieve that, I think maybe by the end of next week, Boris Johnson might possibly wish that he'd opted for the career of a rock star after all.
Vicky, many thanks. Our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young there.
Not one, but two former occupants of number 10 have now condemned the Prime Minister's decision to suspend Parliament. But Mr Johnson said that MPs trying to block a no-deal departure were damaging his chances of getting a deal with the EU. Scotland's highest civil court refused another legal bid by parliamentarians to order a temporary halt to prorogation, but did agree to a full hearing on the matter next week. From Westminster, here's our correspondent, Victoria MacDonald.
Hi, good morning. Hello, good morning, good morning, good morning.
You know you're getting old when even the journalists start looking young.
I have a mini Boris that's made out of Lego and plastic.
The Prime Minister took questions from these school reporters ahead of an announcement of £14 billion for the education budget.
I'm an Arsenal fan. I think Arsenal will do well this season.
Right.
What makes you feel you'll have a good year this year?
Right.
We will tell you his response later. But after this session, he sat down for brief interviews with other broadcasters except Channel 4 News and was asked how worried he was about attempts to block him from a no-deal Brexit.
It's vital that our EU friends don't constantly think at the back of their minds, this thing could be blocked in Parliament. There's no way that the Brexit can be thwarted anyway. If they think Brexit can be blocked anyway, they're not going to give us the deal we need.
This interview was given before the former Prime Minister John Major announced that he wants to join the court action next week by the anti-Brexit campaigner Gina Miller to prevent the shutting down of Parliament. He said in a statement, "I promised that if the Prime Minister prorogued Parliament in order to prevent members from opposing his Brexit plans, I would seek judicial review of his action." This was delightedly described by some commentators as blue on blue. The Prime Minister has ordered a suspension of Parliament for up to 5 weeks before a Queen's speech on October the 14th.
What Boris Johnson has done by calling this very lengthy prorogation in the middle of a political crisis is in effect ignoring the conventions and the precedents, so that's pushing it into the courts. It's pushing us in the direction of a legal constitution, which is more like what most other countries have. So what he's done is unprecedented, and we could see potentially unprecedented action by the courts to stop him.
In the first round, however, the Scottish court today rejected a request to immediately block that suspension, though it has agreed to a full hearing on Tuesday with a similar case to be heard in Northern Ireland. And in the meantime, a second former Prime Minister, this time Gordon Brown, said following talks with several senior EU leaders, he believed the European Union will withdraw the October 31st Brexit deadline, and that could put pressure on Boris Johnson to reach a deal. Any suggestion, though, of a deal infuriated the Brexit Party, which warned they would hold the Prime Minister's feet to the fire if he does not go for a clean break.
If he's prepared to put country before party and to go for a clean break Brexit, which we believe is the right answer, the right solution, the best deal now, then we will help him, we will support him. We will not stand candidates against Conservative Party candidates if he's trying to do the right thing. If he wants to do the right thing, then we will do the right thing. But if he wants to reheat this withdrawal agreement, we will fight him in every seat to prevent that happening.
If you think this week has been a political rollercoaster, just wait until next week. That's when MPs return to the House of Commons, and when, as we understand it, those opposed to a no-deal Brexit will attempt to take control of the order papers and to, as Jeremy Corbyn put it, legislate rapidly. Which brings us back to the question from the young reporter about how the Prime Minister's year is looking. Boris Johnson said, not surprisingly, that he thinks he's going to have a good year. Once, he said, we get all this Brexit thing done.
Victoria MacDonald. Well, the SNP's Joanna Cherry led the legal challenge brought by 75 parliamentarians in Scotland's top civil court, seeking to block the Prime Minister's decision to suspend Parliament. I spoke to her earlier and began by asking her if she's looking at the courts to solve problems where politicians can't.
No, we're looking at the courts to review the exercise of power by the executive and to prevent the executive from shutting down Parliament. So it's quite the opposite of what you say, Matt. What we're trying to do is make sure that Parliament sits for the planned length of time so that it can carry out the scrutiny of Brexit envisaged in acts of Parliament such as the EU Withdrawal Act.
Despite the suspension of Parliament, you do have a few days to get your act together. Do you think you can?
Well, clearly what the legal actions are seeking to do is to prevent Parliament from being suspended. But in the meantime, I and others are working cross-party to hatch a strategy for next week to make best use of the time that we have. So all is not lost, but the importance of the court actions is to review the legality of the Prime Minister's actions in effectively shutting down Parliament for reasons that are now in the public domain. I mean, the cat's out of the bag, given what the Defence Secretary said off camera, and indeed given interviews that Boris Johnson himself has given. The reason for shutting down Parliament is he knows he can't get his way while Parliament is sitting, so he shut it down. Now, that's the sort of thing that happens in unelected dictatorships, not in one of the oldest democracies in the world.
Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, said today that the United Kingdom was now in peril. For you, this is a bit of an opportunity, isn't it?
Well, the United Kingdom is in peril, and even if we manage to sort this mess out and to restore democracy at Westminster and to prevent a hard Brexit, Scots have looked on in horror at the events of the last 3 years, and as a series of opinion polls have recently shown, if there were to be another independence referendum, the majority of people would vote yes.
Despite all the outrage, the developments in London this week are, for the Scottish National Party, a blessing in disguise, aren't they?
A blessing in disguise for Scotland. Well, a hard Brexit could never be described as a blessing in disguise for Scotland, nor could a no-deal Brexit be described as a blessing in disguise, because the Scottish economy and Scottish society will take massive hits, and it won't be rich people like Boris Johnson and his chums that suffer. It will be my working class constituents in Edinburgh South West who will suffer job losses and food shortages and medicine
But it gives you a much stronger case for independence.
So I'm keen to prevent that from happening. But the fact... Well, actually, the fact of the matter, Matt, is that the case for independence exists independently of a no-deal Brexit. The case for independence exists because the events of the last 3 years since the European Union referendum have shown that Scotland is not an equal partner in the European Union. Scotland is not an equal partner in the United Kingdom. Scotland's views and Scotland's voice is not respected, and that the Westminster Parliament can run roughshod over Holyrood when it so wishes.
Joanna Cherry there of the SNP. Well, in a short while we'll be speaking live to Lord Heseltine, but a little earlier I spoke to Andrew Bridgen, a member of the European Research Group, the ERG of the Conservative Party. I began by asking him if John Major is still a Conservative in his book.
I think it's disappointing that John Major's taking this action when he's actually the last Prime Minister who actually used prorogation for political purposes to avoid some sort of political scandal. But John Major can do what he wishes. The fact is we've now got a Prime Minister who's determined to get us out of the European Union, deliver on the mandate of the referendum, and he's got the guts to do it.
So if he does get a deal out of Brussels, will he support him come what may?
I'd have to look at the deal. I applaud his efforts to get the backstop removed from the withdrawal agreement, but there's far from just the backstop that's wrong with the current withdrawal agreement. What I want, and I believe Boris Johnson wants, is a Super Canada style free trade agreement. I think we can have that by triggering GATT 24, offering a quota and tariff-free trade for 10 years while we enter into detailed and comprehensive talks for a free trade agreement with the European Union, which will be the biggest customer for EU goods. 70% of all their exports should come to the UK after we leave.
But if he comes back from Brussels with something less than that, are you still prepared to pull the plug on Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, as you did on Theresa May?
I would have to have a long and very pragmatic look at whatever Boris Johnson comes back with. But at the end of the day, he'll come back with whatever the European Union are willing to give us.
Now, Boris Johnson, as we all know, voted for Theresa May's deal the third time round. Do you actually trust him?
Boris is a political realist. He knows as well as I do what's required of the Conservative government. We've got to deliver on the mandate and leave the European Union. We've already missed 2 deadlines, and the country has noticed. You've seen how we dropped in the polls at the European elections, and you've seen since Boris has taken a more Eurosceptic line than his predecessor, how we've risen in the polls. We're heading for a general election. I think in the next 9 months, we have to have left the European Union, and Boris understands that.
If that Parliament votes to extend the deadline to delay Brexit yet again, should Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, ignore Parliament?
Parliament can't, as far as I can see, force the Prime Minister to ask for an extension. We have a Parliament, I think, that's a bit out of touch with the electorate. Only 160 MPs in our Parliament actually campaigned to leave, and 52% of the population voted to leave. At the end of the day, Boris Johnson is going to call the shots.
Andrew Bridgen, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your holiday.
Well, by the time this goes out, I shall already be at the airport on my way back to the UK, so you can rest assured that democracy will be secured when I get back.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, we don't give up on this programme, so let's give the technology another go and try to go back to Lord Heseltine in Montenegro. Lord Heseltine, let me attempt this again. Would you ever have imagined seeing a former Tory Prime Minister taking a current Prime Minister to court over the suspension of Parliament?
No. I think it is the most extraordinary manifestation of the great constitutional crisis that Britain is going through. John Major would have agonised over the choice he had to make between what he sees as the overriding national interest and the interest of the party that he's served so nobly over so long a period. He's come to the conclusion that the national self-interest must prevail, and of course I strongly support him in that judgment.
The referendum was held 3 years ago in order to create peace in the Tory party over Europe after decades of strife. It's doing the exact opposite, isn't it? It is tearing this party apart. Your party. What is actually left of the Tory party today that you can identify with?
Well, I have to say that the catalogue of denials from members of the cabinet about why there was not going to be a prorogation of Parliament, I find deeply embarrassing. But the fact of the matter is, one mustn't be too insular. This is not a split in the Conservative Party. It's a split in every part of the country, every family, every company, every party. And there is no short-term, easy way of dealing with this. The fact of the matter is that the referendum campaign was a giant confidence trick. It was a deception of historic scale. And now, in order to try and stampede it through the Commons, Parliament is being set aside, prorogued, shut down, collapsed.
Right. So what would you say to those Tory party colleagues, cabinet members, who all campaigned on their opposition to prorogation, calling it the end of democracy and the beginning of dictatorship, and now have said nothing? What would you say to them?
Well, I've anguished over all this the last 24 or 48 hours because some of them I know, not all of them, and I think they will live the rest of their lives with those quotations round their necks. I don't think there is any conceivable way on this absolutely transcendental issue facing the British people and our future and the younger generation that they can live with the statements that they made about what they believe. I don't even know, I'm on holiday in Montenegro, whether the cabinet actually was informed that prorogation had been requested. You probably do know that. But did they know? Were they told? Were they consulted? It is the most extraordinary situation.
Hopefully we'll find out. We've got to leave it there, Lord Heseltine. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, the Prime Minister's decision to prorogue Parliament has been condemned by two former occupants of number 10. But Mr Johnson said that MPs trying to block a no-deal departure were damaging his chances of getting a deal with the EU. Meanwhile, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has encouraged people to come out onto the streets tomorrow. And I'm joined now by Michael Chesham, a self-described hard left, hard remain campaigner for Momentum, the group that has threatened to shut down the streets tomorrow in protest at the suspension of Parliament, and by Culver Ranger, who was an advisor to the now Prime Minister Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. Welcome to you both. Protests on the streets tomorrow. How many people are you expecting and how many cities?
We are expecting hundreds of thousands across the whole of the UK in dozens of different locations. In London, we'll be at 12 noon outside Downing Street. You know, this is an enormous issue about which an enormous number of people feel very, very strongly, and we're seeing that reflected in the numbers we're getting.
So we had two enormous demonstrations in London for the People's Vote, you know, petition signed by more than 6 million people. It has led to absolutely nothing. What makes you sure that your protest will have any impact at all?
Well, look, what Boris Johnson wants to do is to force through a Brexit settlement which deregulates the economy, attacks migrants and wrecks communities. And he has no mandate to do this, let alone in the country or in Parliament. And so as a result, he is totally undermining our entire democratic system. And under those conditions, when the channels of democracy are being eroded by the government, it's a vital part of our democratic system that civil disobedience springs up and that a protest movement forms that can challenge the power of the government.
Culver Ranger, it took your former boss, the Mayor of London, who prided himself on being able to reach both the Labour parts of the city and the Tory parts of the city and the bits in the middle, to divide the country this much that people are coming out on the streets tomorrow.
Well, firstly, obviously, civil disobedience, I don't think anybody should be suggesting that. Let's be honest, there was a vote, there was a referendum, what people now call a people's vote.
We're talking about what he's done with Parliament just in the last few days.
Well, Boris is doing what he did actually when he became mayor. He set out an agenda. Even back then in 2008, we were a new mayoralty, he was a new mayor. He wanted to do things. He wanted to change the look and feel of London, and he disagreed with a lot of people.
But he governed with consensus, did he not?
He did.
A tiny minority of the population agree with the prorogation.
But what I want to understand is, what are people actually protesting against exactly? Because right now, this Prime Minister is at the end game of a negotiation, and let's be clear, this is a negotiation with the EU. He doesn't say he wants a no deal. He doesn't say he wants a hard Brexit. He said he wants the best result for this country and what 17.4 million people wanted, which is to leave on good terms with the EU.
And is shutting down Parliament a legitimate bargaining chip?
Well, you have to negotiate. We've seen 3 years of not having an appropriate position, not being clear with the EU, them coming back to us and saying, we're not budging, we're not moving, we're not giving you what you want, and there being no way for us to negotiate. This is a negotiation. We must remember that.
Michael Chesson, can I just ask you quickly? There are going to be a few days left in which Parliament can get its act together. To call this a coup is slightly disingenuous, and we haven't got tanks on the streets. It may be a very, very British coup, that it doesn't really feel like a coup. Parliament can still save this, right? So why mobilise people in the streets?
Well, look, yes, there aren't tanks on the streets. The executive is trying to shut down the legislature because it thinks that the legislature might disagree with it. That is a deep violation of the Constitution and of the democratic process. Well, there is a window. There's a window by which MPs could potentially take control back. And good luck to Jeremy Corbyn and good luck to the whole opposition in trying to do that. But the way that protest movements work, the way that our democracy works, is that ordinary people have the power to take matters into their own hands. And that doesn't just begin when the coup has finally happened. We have to build a movement now that is capable of opposing this outrage. And we need as many people on the streets as possible.
But the question at the beginning of the segment was, are both sides overplaying their hand? Boris Johnson arguably has overplayed his hand by shutting down Parliament. Are you overplaying your hand by using words like coup?
No, because this is very obviously a power grab by a government which has no mandate to enact a no-deal Brexit that commands a tiny minority support of the population. There is no mandate for this whatsoever.
Your outrage is music to the ears of many Brexiteers out there.
Well, look, the country's very polarised, and yes, look, there's a very fundamental disagreement between me and many people in the country who want Brexit to happen.
I think
to solve that, we need a general election or a public vote on Brexit.
So what we have to say is we've got all the parties have got positions on this. If any party agrees with your position, join them, encourage them, be part of their movement. They've got party conferences coming up, which is traditional at this point, 80 years of where all the parties go and debate. We will then have a Queen's speech on the 14th, and Parliament can discuss the new priorities of this government and where Brexit is.
We've run out of time. Got to leave it there. Covert Ranger Michael Chesson, thanks very much indeed.
Demonstrations are taking place across the UK in protest at Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks in the run-up to Brexit. The government insists it's acting properly, but critics say it's an attempt to bypass democracy. Tens of thousands have taken to the streets from Sheffield to Swansea, Belfast to London. Here's our home editor, Mark Easton.
If you shut down our Parliament, we'll shut down the streets.
Calls for direct action from protesters outside Downing Street. Several thousand people had gathered in Whitehall, many to voice their opposition to Boris Johnson's move to shut down Parliament ahead of Britain's scheduled exit from the European Union on October the 31st.
Stop Brexit!
The crowds were diverse, cutting across class, age, ethnicity and traditional party politics. Today's protest is a reminder of how arguments over Brexit represent a reshaping of political discourse in Britain.
Bankers and corporations who get richer while the workers get poorer.
As well as London, there were similar demonstrations in towns and cities across the country, from Yorkshire to Belfast to Bangor. In London, the apparent unity of the crowd disguised divisions over what they were opposed to. The government's suspension of Parliament, or just the government? Opposed to a no-deal Brexit or leaving the EU at all? Is this about proroguing? Is it about Brexit?
Yeah.
Is it about Conservatives?
A bit of both, really. I mean, mainly proroguing and Brexit, but a bit of both.
Are you a supporter of the European Union?
I'm not a supporter of a bosses club. I'm a supporter of the European workers of Greece, Spain and Italy, but I don't support what is in effect a bosses club in Europe.
So you're anti-EU?
I'm anti the European Union, yes.
I'm opposed to a no-deal Brexit.
Would Brexit with a deal would be okay?
I would prefer we remain, but I could live with a Brexit with a decent deal, yes.
You are a French national.
Yeah.
Why are you here today?
Why am I here today? Because I'm one of the EU 27 who's been living for decades here. It's about no-deal Brexit, it's about the hatred, and it's about hindering democratic processes.
Deeply held feelings are on display as thousands take to the streets. But it's worth reflecting on the people who aren't here, people with equally passionate views on the other side of the Brexit debate. Public opinion and the country are riven as to what democracy should mean. The organisers of today's demonstration say it should be seen as the beginning of a campaign of civil disobedience against the government's treatment of Parliament. Mark Easton, BBC News, Whitehall.
Let's talk to our political correspondent Jessica Parker, who's at Westminster. Jessica, is any of this, the protest today across the country, likely to give the government pause for thought, or is it going to be full steam ahead for prorogation or the suspension of Parliament next week?
Well, look, there's been a lot of noise, a lot of anger today, but does that mean that Boris Johnson is looking out of his window, worried by what he sees and having second thoughts? Well, the evidence suggests so far that this administration isn't exactly afraid of a bit of confrontation. And in that vein, next week, yes, we're set to see court battles, but also an almighty confrontation here in Westminster as a group of cross-party MPs are set to try and bring forward legislation to block the possibility of a no-deal Brexit in the little time that they now have left before Parliament is set to be suspended. I think perhaps for those MPs, today's protest will be a morale booster, shot of energy for the fight ahead. But for those who think that Boris Johnson is taking absolutely the right approach, today's anger, today's noise may well fall on deaf ears.
OK, Jessica, thank you for that. Jessica Parker there at Westminster.
As the row deepens over Brexit and the suspension of Parliament, Boris Johnson has faced anger both inside and outside Downing Street. More in a moment on his head-to-head with his Chancellor, Sajid Javid, over the sacking of an aide. But first, to the thousands of people who took to the streets across the UK today to protest against what they claim is the undemocratic suspension of Parliament. By far the biggest demonstration was outside Downing Street, from where Sejal Carrier reports.
The Prime Minister wasn't home today. Had he been, he might have felt barricaded in. Outside his doorstep, tens of thousands took to the street to protest against his decision to prorogue Parliament. What was palpable here was a real sense of anger.
Lives have been given, wars have been fought for democracy. This kind of action is not democratic. We're not going to have it.
There's a lot of us who actually might think that direct action is necessary now, because we've marched, you know, we've written, we've petitioned, and no one has listened to us.
See, when you have John Major, when you have the former Chancellor taking action in the High Court against the prorogation of Parliament, that's a red line.
The largest demonstration was in Whitehall, but there were others across the UK. From Belfast to Swansea, from Glasgow to Leeds, with many saying these protests weren't just about the politics around Brexit. Including Izzy, a 15-year-old schoolgirl who addressed the crowds in the capital.
I'm here today because democracy is not a partisan issue. It isn't Leave versus Remain. It's not even about Brexit or the EU. Democracy is about making sure all of the voices of this country are listened to.
Despite the thousands here, this has been a peaceful demonstration by people with deeply held passions who say they are fighting against what they see as an erosion of democracy.
Boris Johnson dominated this demonstration despite his absence from it. Protesters say they want him to know they won't give up without a battle. Sejal Carrier, ITV News, Downing Street.
It's been revealed that Mr Johnson has also faced anger inside Downing Street from his own Chancellor, angry at the sacking of a top aide. But today he got the support of another minister who had previously said he would fight against any moves to suspend Parliament. Here's our political correspondent, David Wood.
Good morning, everybody.
They are meant to be the closest of political allies. And despite a reported bust-up last night, today Sajid Javid insists they have a fantastic relationship. But he is said to be furious after the PM's right-hand man Dominic Cummings sacked the Chancellor's advisor Sonia Khan. It's claimed she'd leaked information, although there's been no evidence of that, and no comment either from her now ex-boss.
I don't comment on personnel issues, it would be inappropriate, but when it comes to this government, and whether it's me, the Prime Minister, the entire Cabinet, it is entirely united.
No comment either from inside Number 10, but outside today another row dominates, with those protests and opposition parties plotting to stop a no-deal Brexit.
We will be taking action immediately to do everything we can to get Parliament to declare what it's already done twice, which is its opposition to a no-deal Brexit, and do everything we can to get a measure through Parliament to stop the government taking us out without a deal.
And Conservative rebels say the plan to prorogue Parliament is forcing them to act next week too.
In a sense, the government, ironically, is slightly shooting itself in the foot. By taking away those days, it forces us to act on Tuesday. If they hadn't prorogued Parliament, they could have had more of a chance to go to Brussels and negotiate before we move to stop no deal. We're now forced to act earlier.
But the PM's plan has backing from one of his ministers who had previously ruled out suspending Parliament.
Well, I think that the chances of a deal on Brexit are actually stronger than a lot of people think. And I want to leave the European Union on the 31st of October with a deal. I think we should give the Prime Minister every opportunity to get that deal.
So the battle lines are drawn, and with MPs back here on Tuesday, the Prime Minister is facing his toughest week yet.
So, David, yet more protests. It all seems to be building up to a pretty big confrontation for Mr Johnson next week.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, particularly as momentum is building and MPs are coalescing around this plan to force through a law to stop a no-deal Brexit. And today and over the past few days, I've been trying to talk to some of the senior MPs involved in those plans, and they are all staying very tight-lipped about what they plan to do on Tuesday when Parliament returns. Don't forget, there's been a lot of criticism over the past few months of the MPs who either want to avoid no deal or want to remain, for not being united enough to force the government's hand, and they want to show that's different this time. However, I've heard from a senior Conservative involved saying they're not very confident they will have the numbers. That said, there is a Labour MP told me they're very optimistic. For its part, the government will say, don't block no deal, we need it to get a deal, and we will get a deal. A lot of pressure, particularly on Conservative MPs going into next week.
Indeed, David, for now, thank you.
So the Chancellor has described his relationship with Boris Johnson as fantastic. That's despite the Prime Minister's senior advisor Dominic Cummings sacking one of Sajid Javid's top aides without warning. It comes with reports that Number 10 has warned any Conservative MPs thinking of voting against the government over a no-deal Brexit that they face automatic deselection. Here's Victoria MacDonald.
The former Chancellor Philip Hammond, former Justice Secretary David Gauke and former International Development Secretary Rory Stewart are all thought to be in the Prime Minister's sights should they rebel next week over a no-deal Brexit. According to reports, they and any other Tory who votes against the government are to be threatened with deselection. Something that appeared to be confirmed by Downing Street tonight. In a statement, they said that all options for party management are under consideration, but first and foremost, the PM hopes MPs will deliver on referendum results and back him in Parliament. In a tweet, Mr Hammond said this, however: if true, this would be staggeringly hypocritical. 8 members of the current cabinet have defied the party whip this year. He added, I want to honour our 2017 manifesto, which promised a smooth and orderly exit and a deep and special partnership with the EU, not an undemocratic no deal. This is a critical week for the Prime Minister. He faces a showdown with rebels who could try and seize control of the parliamentary order papers, and there are rumours of plans to sit next weekend, all to force an extension to Brexit. Arriving at the Big Tent Ideas Festival in East London, Mr Stewart said the proroguing of Parliament, shutting it down for 5 weeks, would backfire on Mr Johnson.
Ironically, it's slightly shooting itself in the foot. By taking away those days, it forces us to act on Tuesday. If they hadn't prorogued Parliament, they could have had more of a chance to go to Brussels and negotiate before we move to stop no deal. We're now forced to act earlier.
all of this adding to a febrile political atmosphere. Yesterday, after a visit to a college in Bristol, the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, was said to have returned to Westminster for a showdown with the Prime Minister after his media advisor, Sonia Khan, was sacked and marched out of Downing Street by the police, all without his knowledge. The sacking by the Prime Minister's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, was allegedly over her contacts with the former Chancellor. There were no suggestions she was involved in any leaks. Today, Mr Javid was asked if there were any tensions with the Prime Minister.
This is a Prime Minister that, before he was Prime Minister, someone I've always got on with incredibly well, and it's been a real privilege for me to work with him so closely on delivering on these people's priorities, and that relationship is as strong as ever.
The timing is difficult and distracting ahead of next week, a week that the Labour leader said today presents the last chance to stop a no deal.
Be clear about this. I've met with all the opposition parties on Tuesday morning in my office, and we're going to be working together on Tuesday to challenge this government to stop a no-deal exit, because we believe the enormous damage it will do to the economy of the whole of the UK.
Mr Corbyn has called a meeting of his entire shadow cabinet on Monday to lay out his plans for the following week, and the Prime Minister will also meet with rebels on his own side on Monday, though it's not clear that either side will offer any concessions.
Well, with the prospect of challenges in the courts and the Commons next week, the Prime Minister's decision to suspend Parliament faced opposition on the streets today. Campaigners staged a number of demonstrations around the country, though turnouts varied. The marchers were encouraged by the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Jane Dodge reports.
If the Prime Minister was at home today, he would have been confined to barracks. Thousands of demonstrators blocked Downing Street and Whitehall. Boris Johnson loomed large, not in person though.
This is what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Boris Johnson's got to go!
If there's a stereotype of a Remainer, the man leading this chant doesn't fit it. Simon Taylor spent 17 years as a major in the British Army. Now he works in the NHS.
I voted to remain. I respect entirely the result of the referendum. We did not vote to crash out of the European Union.
The organisers of today's demonstrations say they're not about remain or leave, they're about democracy. They say people who voted both ways in the 2016 referendum are here today.
But finding anyone in the crowds who voted leave proved challenging.
Did you vote to leave?
No, I didn't.
Can I ask you, so did you vote to leave?
Absolutely not.
Did you vote to leave, madam?
No, I voted Remain, definitely.
Do you know anyone here who did vote to leave?
No.
Then I heard a rumour that there was a Brexiteer on a bike in the crowd, but it transpired he just happened to be passing.
Had I known it was going to be here, I might have come a bit more suitably dressed and with a banner.
And what would your banner have said?
The people have already voted.
Like our cyclist, James Cashman also voted to leave, but he told demonstrators Boris Johnson had gone a step too far.
I really do feel that the ends do not justify the means, and more leavers should be out on the streets saying we voted for parliamentary sovereignty, we're not going to let this sly, arrogant Prime Minister just rip up parliamentary sovereignty. For whatever reason, it's not right.
The Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, told the crowd the Prime Minister wanted to close down democracy and force through a no-deal Brexit.
You will not undermine our democracy! We will stop this coup!
If demonstrators were hoping to see Jeremy Corbyn, they went home disappointed. He was in Scotland, but not at any of the numerous demonstrations up there. He had, though, encouraged his MPs to attend the 32 official rallies across the UK.
The leader of the opposition is nowhere to be seen.
I can assure you that I'm getting Jeremy's message across. I can assure you that Barry Gardner's getting Jeremy's message across. I can assure you that John McDonnell is getting Jeremy's message across. Jeremy may be the leader of the party, but we are all in this together in terms of we will fight for democracy.
A small number of Brexit supporters unfurled a Brexit Now banner at the Cenotaph in Whitehall. A line of police officers stood between them and Stop the Coup demonstrators. Some of them also marched to Buckingham Palace, angry at the Queen's approval of the Prime Minister's request to suspend Parliament. Some walked up to the gates of the palace. The Queen, like Mr Corbyn, is in Scotland. The Metropolitan Police say a small number of people have been arrested.
Well, back at home, thousands of protesters joined demonstrations in more than 30 cities across the UK today, many angry at the Prime Minister's plans to suspend Parliament. But as demonstrators massed around Downing Street, Conservative MPs were gathering on the other side of London for a more relaxed event in a field, a festival of ideas dubbed the Tory Glastonbury, where the Health Secretary told us that MPs need to get behind Boris Johnson. Our political correspondent Kate McCann reports from Westminster.
The sun may be shining on Whitehall, but there's an unmistakable shift in the air and protesters are angry.
Boris! 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 Boris!
The musicians are playing, but summer is over and time is running out. MPs have spent the last few weeks calculating their next move, and some have decided to trade party loyalty to stop a no-deal Brexit, discussing how that might work at a political ideas festival in London today. Their hands forced by Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament, cutting time in the Commons, they're getting ready to make their move.
We'll be forced to go before because the timetable's been squeezed, so we have to act immediately. I think people are being too optimistic about a no-deal Brexit. I think it'll be deeply damaging and unnecessary. We'll regret it for 40 years, both in terms of the economic impact, but also because it will divide our society. It's a very divisive, polarising thing to do. We need a compromise, and we need to work towards a compromise, and I'll be fighting for that.
The need for consensus is important.
But others in the same party believe there's still time. They've put their faith in the Prime Minister to deliver a deal.
I think that the chances of a deal on Brexit are actually stronger than a lot of people think. And I want to leave the European Union on the 31st of October with a deal. I think we should give the Prime Minister every opportunity to get that deal, and then Parliament will have time after the 17th of October to be able to debate whatever deal he can bring back.
The atmosphere here at this festival, where MPs are discussing politics in the sunshine, feels a million miles away from anger and protest over Brexit. But make no mistake, the colourful flags and the beer tent can't mask that tension just under the surface about what happens next. And here, just a few miles down the road in Westminster, that frustration has spilled out onto the streets as people demand Boris Johnson stop a no-deal Brexit. Lots of MPs agree with them, but how will they translate this into policy that works? The Labour leader believes it's now or never.
Parliament resumes on Tuesday, and we will be taking action immediately to do everything we can to get Parliament to declare what it's already done twice, which is its opposition to a no-deal Brexit, and do everything we can to get measures through Parliament to stop the government taking us out without a deal.
Parliament is split, but that's nothing new. What's changed is the calculation among MPs who want to stop the UK leaving without a deal. More than ever before are prepared to trade party loyalty for the principle, and next week is when they finally show their hands. Kate McCann, Sky News.
Well, protests have been taking place right around the UK. In fact, protesters rallied in 34 locations. Sky News was in Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol and London. And Sky's Katerina Vitozzi sent this report from the protest in Manchester.
And I am very nearly 65 years old.
So I'm Toby Brownstone, I'm 19, I'm from Stratford-upon-Avon.
I'm Will, this is Violet and we're from Manchester.
Many people from many places, in the sunshine and the rain, with one message.
Stop the coup! Stop the coup!
Here in Manchester, there was the very wet, the very young, and the very angry.
It wasn't till Wednesday that I, and a lot of you I imagine, realised just how deeply we care about our country, our people, our rights and our democracy.
this is the first demonstration I've brought my family to, basically, so I'm a bit ambiguous about the whole Brexit process, but I feel at least we should be discussing it, and not everyone voted for a no-deal Brexit.
The Prime Minister says we're leaving. Yeah. So what do you think can be done? I mean, doesn't it feel like this is just, it's too late?
It might be too late, but I think he's not doing the best he can to try and get an actual deal that would be the best for the country. He's just decided we're leaving, and I can't be bothered to sort it out properly, so I'm just going to not give anybody the option.
On the fringes, there was a small pro-Brexit group. Although, rather surprisingly, Brexit wasn't the main B word mentioned here today.
Boris Johnson's actions are undemocratic, and basically I think he's frightened that he can't put his agenda in front of the Houses of Parliament, because he knows that he'll lose any vote that is taken on that.
What's been interesting after speaking to people here is that not everyone is an anti-Brexit campaigner, as you might expect. There are some people here who've never been to a protest before, who say that it is the suspension of Parliament which has brought them here. They say it's simply a step too far.
And thousands took that message to the Prime Minister's door in London.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
I think it's Boris Johnson's particular disregard for Parliament and for our MPs and for our democracy that's made people so cross. But no-deal Brexit is bad for jobs anyway.
Proroguing Parliament is a desperate step for any government, and I think it's very, very dangerous for the UK. And I think we have to do our absolute best to persuade those in power to not go down that route.
In the West Midlands, the biggest protest was in Birmingham. In an area where the majority voted to leave, this minority fought to be heard.
Not happy with Boris. I think the fact that he got into government in the first place was out of order. The fact that he called off Parliament again, out of order. I think it's just time people actually had a chance to say how they feel. If people get into a big group and actually say something about it, maybe someone will hear.
This mess will go on for 3 generations, or for 30 years. You know, it's so sad, actually, to see our country like this. I feel so ashamed of our country.
What do you want to see happen? What do you want to be the result of demonstrations like this?
I'd like to see people opening up to talk to each other and find a way forward.
Stop the coup! Stop the coup!
Protesters out on the streets today say they are defending democracy. But for the many Leave voters, democracy means Brexit. The divide between these two sides feels wider than ever. Caterina Vitozzi, Sky News in Manchester.
Well, let's catch up with our political correspondent Kate McCann, who joins us from Westminster this evening. Kate, seems as though there's certainly widespread frustration. There's a lot of frustration within Parliament. How much of a crunch point is next week going to be?
Well, I think, Isabel, that it really will be the crunch point next week. Now, I know we've said this a number of times before. You've heard us say, political correspondents have said that Brexit's really coming down to this week or this day. But next week will be the decision that MPs have to make about whether they are going to decide on party loyalty or their principles. And for some of them, that will be a really difficult decision and something they've spent the summer having a think about. Now, you heard from Rory Stewart a little bit earlier on in that film that we made, talking about how he's decided that he needs to do everything he possibly can to stop a no-deal Brexit. And he thinks there are enough MPs, even on the Conservative side of the House, who are going to vote with Labour in order to do that. Now, that will be against their own Prime Minister, so for many of them, that will be a big line in the sand. In fact, there are some reports that if Conservative MPs do go down that road and do back legislation to stop a no-deal Brexit, that the government, Boris Johnson, will treat that as a confidence vote, and they may not be able to stand for the party in future elections, so it could really be a matter of their careers on the line next week. And then, of course, there is a question about what those plans could entail, whether there will be enough MPs to support them, whether even the House of Commons could do something like this to try and block a no-deal Brexit. That will all come down to a head on Tuesday, when Jeremy Corbyn and another team of MPs will expose the legislation that they believe will be the key to doing that.
At the same time, Boris Johnson is saying that he is still working to get a deal with the European Union, and in fact warning that the more talk there is of trying to block a no-deal Brexit, the harder it will be for him to get that deal. He believes that there is some movement possible with the European Union, and there's just enough time to strike that deal. In fact, Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, was saying he was urging MPs to back the government, to hold their horses and wait and see if Mr Johnson can deliver that deal. The question is, what will MPs do this coming week? Do they believe there is enough time to stop this process? If at the end of the month, towards October, it still looks like a no-deal Brexit will be the only way the UK leaves the European Union, that calculation is the one they're making over this weekend. But certainly the balance is seeming to move towards MPs backing, joining together, trying to support legislation against a no-deal Brexit. And if they do that, there'll be a big question for Boris Johnson about what he does next. It's all going to happen next week when the House of Commons returns.
OK, Kate, thanks very much indeed.